Thank you for joining us. Our webinar is going to begin in just a few moments, so please just stand by while we allow some of the other registrants to log in. We're so happy to see you this afternoon. Well, thank you all for joining us. Good morning and welcome to our first Leading Local webinar, which is the role of local government in times of national crisis. My name is Erica Manuel, and I'm the CEO and Executive Director of the Institute for Local Government, and I will be your moderator today. Next slide, please. I'm so excited to be here with all of you virtually on this beautiful Thursday morning, which will lead into the afternoon. I know a lot of you in California got some much needed rain yesterday, or maybe hail or snow in the last few days. But where I am in Roseville right now, it is bright and sunny, and the perfect way to kick off our Leading Local webinar series. Before we get started, just a couple of housekeeping notes and disclaimers. We are recording today's webinar, and we'll share the recording and any related resources with all of the registrants following the webinar via email. All of your lines have been muted for the duration of this session, but you can ask a question at any time by typing it into the questions box in the right-hand side of your screen. If you have any technical difficulties during this session or any questions of our panelists during their presentations, feel free to use that questions box and that function. Next slide. Today's webinar is the very first session of ILG's brand new Leading Local webinar series. It's very fitting that we're launching this series actually on the 1-year anniversary of the shelter-in-place orders for many communities across the country. The past year, I think, has tested local government leaders arguably more than any other year in recent or modern history. And like many of you, the team at ILG had to make significant pivots to everything from our operations to our business model to really respond to the changing dynamics in our state. We watched local government leaders barely and bravely adjust to the new normal, working excessive hours and really giving everything to keep their cities, counties, and special districts afloat. Leading Local is a series that was born out of the trend that we experienced in 2020. Local government leaders are smart, they are committed, they are innovative, but many of you might know that you are also, some of you are exhausted after an entire year of nonstop crisis response. So Leading Local has been designed really to help local leaders understand how to continue to serve as role models and think about how they can advance their communities and really demonstrate for their peers resilience in these ever-changing times. It's also a thought leadership forum. It's going to be focused on addressing those difficult topics, sensitive issues that local government leaders are facing right now. We've identified a wide range of topics, and we'll cover issues and challenges like leading through conflict, civility and ethics, building personal resilience, and more. And because budgets are tight and time is ticking, all of the Leading Local sessions will be free and specially curated with content for elected officials and staff at California cities, counties, and special districts. So today's webinar is the very first session of this series, and we'll be discussing the role of local government in times of national crisis. When I thought about the series and how I wanted to kick things off and to set the stage for the larger series, I thought about two things. What happened at our nation's capital on January 6th, and a conversation that I had with the city manager a few months ago about the intersectionality of the crisis that we're facing right now. With a contentious election cycle, civil unrest, economic uncertainty, and a global health crisis, local leaders are being impacted on all sides. The person that I spoke with needed some advice. They needed to know where to focus their time when everything else impacts everything else. And as they say, all politics is local, but the national response to some of these issues over the past year has challenged the roles and responsibilities of our local leaders. So for today's panel, we're going to hear from 4 local government icons you can see on your screen right now about how best to tackle topics like social justice, equity, COVID response, and the growing polarization in our communities. We're going to acknowledge how decisions and actions at the local and national level are impacting local governments on the ground. And I'm so excited that you've joined us today. So now that I've allowed enough of you to join, I'd like to give you a quick overview of this webinar technology and logistics before we introduce our panelists formally. I also want to give you a short overview of ILG for those of you who are not familiar with our organization, and then we'll move right into the panel discussion. We've also structured this webinar to be free-flowing and allow time for questions throughout or at the end, so feel free to use that questions box as you see fit, and we will do our best to pepper those questions throughout the discussion. Next slide, please. So just a little bit about how this webinar will work, even though we have been sheltering in place for a year now, and we spend a lot of time in virtual meetings and webinars. Every technology solution is a little different. Always good to clarify the technical details. So for today, all participants will be on mute during the entire presentation. If you have any questions during the webinar, you can type your questions into the questions box at any time during the session, and we will make sure to drop those in when it's the most appropriate. Please note that there are 2 boxes. There's a questions box and a chat box. They are different. The chat box, it could be seen by all of the panelists. The questions box goes directly to the organizers, and we will make sure to put you in the queue. The ILG team will be working throughout this session to review all the questions and determine the best time to ask them during the session. And then any questions you might have about logistics can be dropped into the chat box, and we can make sure to handle those as well. Questions for our panelists are the Q&A box and will likely be answered, if not during the session, at the very end during our formal Q&A portion. Next slide, please. Before we dive into the panelist introductions, I just want to tell you a little bit about ILG. As I mentioned during the intro, my name is Erica Manuel. I'm the CEO and Executive Director of the Institute for Local Government. I've been on the helm, at the helm of this organization now for 2 years, and I'd say, just like many of you, we are still navigating COVID and adjusting to just all of the twists and the turns of the past year. 2020, I think we would all agree, was one of the most difficult years for local government in probably a lifetime. And the good news for you is that ILG is nonprofit, we are nonpartisan, and we are here to help. We are the nonprofit training and education affiliate of 3 statewide associations representing local government, the League of California Cities, or affectionately now known as Cal Cities, CSAC, and the California Special Districts Association. Together with those 3 affiliates, we serve over 2,500 local agencies that include cities, counties, and special districts. And we use and provide practical and easy to use resources so that local agency leaders can effectively implement policies on the ground. And we love and we kind of understand local government, so that's why everything we do centers around helping local leaders navigate complexity and the challenges and the changes of their roles. And that's one of the reasons why I'm super excited to have and host this webinar today. The Leading Local series is really focused on acknowledging the pressures of local leadership and supporting each of you during this time. Next slide, please. We have 4 main programs of work, or pillars as we call them: leadership and governance, civics education and workforce, public engagement, and sustainable and resilient communities. And as we work to help local leaders navigate that complexity, we also hope to help them build trust in their communities. And we do that by offering a range of services across all of our pillars. You can see that on the right-hand side of the screen: education and training, technical assistance, and even capacity building to help you stretch and deliver on programs and services in your communities. We also convene key stakeholders and provide facilitation services around sticky and sometimes challenging topics where it's helpful to have a neutral party in the room that understands how local government works and can speak the language of your community. Next slide. ILG's leadership and governance work has been a foundation of our organization for many years, and the resources that we offer and the consulting services we provide have helped elected leaders and staff really build a strong foundation of good government, which is trust, it's accountability, it's responsiveness, and it's transparency. And we think that focusing on leadership and ethics and accountability and equity really do help cities, counties, special district leaders increase trust with their residents and their communities. And we would hope that you will visit our website to learn more about what we do and to download our free resources. Next slide. This year, as part of our COPIC Pivot, we are excited to host dozens of webinars around topics around those 4 pillars that you just saw on the screen prior. And we're going to be partnering tomorrow with Rennie Public Law Group to kick off a new series for practitioners on public safety reform. I'll be discussing the catalyst and context for that reform from about 9:15 to 11 or 9:30 to 11:15. And we'll also be hosting a session on housing laws and ordinances on Thursday, April 1. And both of those sessions are free. Feel free to visit our website for details and to register. Next slide. So I cannot wait to get to our panel presentation. I'm humbled, I am honored, and I love sharing this virtual stage with 4 local government, I call them icons. They're gonna balk at that, but I think it's true. I am privileged really to have the benefit of their wisdom on a regular basis. And when I was designing this session, I thought there could be no one more perfect to discuss the real state of local government right now than these phenomenal panelists. Together, these 4 people, I think, probably have over 100 to 150 years of public service under their belt. Our first panelist on the screen is Greg Cox. He has served as a county supervisor for the County of San Diego for over 26 years. Prior to that, he was a city council member and a mayor of Chula Vista. He just retired in the last few months. He is known as a collaborator, a doer, and a statesman, and we are so excited to have Greg Cox with us today. Thank you, Greg, for being here.
Thank you, Erica.
Our next panelist is Henry Gardner. Henry also has had a long, distinguished career in both the public and the private sectors. He was appointed city manager for the city of Oakland at the age of 36 and had the longest tenure in that position in the city's history. In 1992, City and State magazine named him the most valuable city manager in the country, and that is no small feat. He went on to have a robust career leading his own private consulting firm and has served as executive director of ABAG. He's done numerous stints as interim city manager in the East Bay and the Bay Area. Henry, thank you for being here. Our next panelist is Rod Gould. Rod has had a long and illustrious career in public service and consulting as well. He was a city manager of Monrovia, Poway, San Rafael, Santa Monica before he quote unquote retired, but he still provides consulting services and expertise, heavily involved in ICMA and many other organizations. A fantastic addition to our panel. Thank you, Rod, for being here.
My pleasure.
And our last panelist is Pat Martell. During her 38 years of service in local government, Pat has held executive leadership positions with over 5 California municipalities, including the cities of Inglewood, South San Francisco, Daly City, San Francisco, and Hayward. She is committed to advancing public service in every way possible, and she served as the ICMA president in 2015. She's been a member of the CCMS Foundation Board, the City Managers Department of the Cal Cities Group, Women Leading Government Board, and the Local Government Hispanic Network Board. She also recently retired from being a city manager, but has been incredibly busy, and I think you'll see a trend with all of our panelists, and she's super active in her role with the ICMA in the West Coast. So please join me in welcoming all of our panelists. I can't hear you, but I know that you're giving them a virtual round of applause. There are 2 additional things I should note about all of our panelists. The first thing is that all of these incredible icons are current or former members of the ILG board, and I am so grateful to them for their past and present service. The other thing to note is that all of these panelists are also retired, and that is not a coincidence. It was actually intentional. So as I was developing this session and the Leading Local series in general, it was really important to me that we were able to have a candid conversation about the reality of leading in public service. And so I asked Greg and Henry and Rod and Pat to join us today because, first of all, they are all brilliant, but second of all, they're also candid and they're thoughtful, and they're not going to sugarcoat anything. And so I really do appreciate and hope that these panelists will be able to speak their mind as we discuss the many important topics on the docket for today. So with that, we are going to drop our slide deck and dive right into our first session. We can see you all, and you're all on mute, and I will be working with our teams behind the scenes. In case there are any issues with sound, we will definitely do our part to make sure that you can hear us and see us as we move forward. So we're going to dive right in with a question around what we've all just experienced, let's say, for the last year. We have just emerged from a very contentious and polarizing election cycle. What do you think is the role of local government to really bridge the divides and really begin repairing community relationships at the local level? And then not only what is our role, but maybe you can talk a little bit about what are some of the possible ways that we could achieve that, if that is in fact the role of local government. And I will ask you to go in whatever order you would like.
Well, I'll start off. I think what we are learning and have learned about the polarizing impacts that have been arising in communities over COVID and other issues affecting the country is the importance of engagement. Community engagement, I think, is fundamental to dealing with the issue of polarization and trying to get at the heart of issues like social justice and equity. Because I think that only through conversations that community leaders convene are we going to really be able to hear from the communities that are affected by inequity and social justice issues. Because I do believe that equity is best defined by those who actually are experiencing inequity. And if we're not open to hearing from those individuals about what their needs are and how local government and government at all levels for that matter can best address those needs, then we can't sit and just in a vacuum try to solve these huge problems affecting our communities today.
I would add to Pat's comments. In my view, we start where we probably end, and that is at the local level. Because what we see at the national level emanates from what is happening or not happening at the local level. Having community dialogue about, first, what is it that we have in common and what is it that we can agree on? And then set the stage for honest communication about what we do not agree on. And doing that always treating each other with dignity and respect. Personal attacks never advance any good cause. But having conversation where people feel safe to say what they think, to say where they come from, why they feel the way that they do. I am saddened by, I think we all are, about what we witnessed on January 6th and what we witnessed leading up to that. I think that we need to have an honest conversation about what it truly means to be a democratic society. Mm-hmm. And so I would say first and foremost, the most democratic societies are those that make sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to participate in the democracy and have honest discussion about that. Politics can be very passionate. Those of us who are engaged in it, either as administrators or elected officials, and the citizens who watch and comment and act on what we do, come from very strong opinions. But we need to respect each other, have honest conversation, and start those at the community level. I think that is the beginning of this process.
You know, there's nothing like a crisis to really demonstrate the disparities that exist in any community. And I think every community has disparities that they maybe don't want to acknowledge, but a crisis such as we've been going through now for the past year, I think really not only amplifies, but I think it makes very evident those things that aren't being met in different portions of your community. And, you know, most communities have areas of high wealth and you know, relatively new housing. Other parts of your communities, I'm sure, are older and maybe don't have curbs and gutters and sidewalks, and the health services aren't the same in those areas. So a crisis like we've been going through, I think, more than any probably other event that I can think of, really is an eye-opener. And we should all, as elected officials, take an opportunity to learn from that. I think one of the ways you deal with that is you try to reach out in the community. You need to listen a lot more than talk. You need to maybe have town hall meetings where you invite in people from different parts of the community to share with you what they're experiencing and what their needs are. And different parts of the community are going to have different needs. You need to be able to distinguish between what's desirable and what's really needed and where those disparities are. One of the things we did in San Diego County this last year, and it was partly as a reflection of some of the things that were going on nationally, as we established, or I should say reestablished, a Human Relations Commission. And that was done with the thought that, we've got a lot of people in different parts of our county that are underserved or underrepresented and have tremendous disparities, not only in housing, but health, social services. So this is an effort to try to reach out and frankly do a lot more listening. Bottom line is nobody knows local government better than local elected officials. And so I think we have to look at this pandemic and the social unrest really as an opportunity to begin to address some of the issues that have really been there for a long time that frankly a lot of us, probably even including myself, have kind of turned a blind eye to.
Building on the excellent comments from the panel, I think there's three things that local leaders could consider to help heal the divide that you refer to, Erica. The first is along the lines of what Pat and Henry and Greg have already addressed in civic engagement. Much of the divide has to do with the ignorance of people of different viewpoints. And it's because we are now in silos of people of similar opinions, and we obtain our information from very narrow sources, and hence we tend to lock into positions and make enemies of those that don't agree with them. So the suggestion is to use advanced civic engagement techniques to mix people together that normally wouldn't interact. Get out of City Hall or the government center, have these meetings in the community, have them at small round tables where you mix people who haven't met each other before, neighbors talking to neighbors, and as indicated by Greg, a lot more listening, very little talking by the government officials, and listen to people, listen to each other. And you'll find that they will begin to find common ground. I wouldn't take on the biggest issues of the day, race and equity, immediately. I would go after more direct issues of local government interest and try to build from there. Similarly, I would come up with civic renewal projects that rely heavily on volunteers, on the notion that's been proven time and time again that when people are working together for the common good, they tend to find more common ground with one another. So I would come up with those projects and try to get as many civilian volunteers as possible to work on them. And then lastly, model the kind of behavior at the government level that you hope and expect of the community itself in all meetings, in all ways. Respect amongst the elected leaders, respect between the elected leaders and the community they serve, and respect with the professional staff that support them. Model the behavior that you hope for the wider community.
Thank you, Rod, and all of our panelists. You bring up a really interesting point, Rod, and something that we just saw in the Q&A box from an attendee that's wondering about this because maybe in their experience, they're not seeing that model of civility, that model of respect in their by their local leaders. And so how do you have these conversations and maintain respect for each other and respect for the community and encourage others to have that when they're not seeing it demonstrated maybe at the leadership level? What recommendations do you have for those in local leadership that are struggling by not being able to really to understand how to get their colleagues maybe or their peers to model the behavior that you think is so important for building and bridging those divides?
This sounds like a project for ILG. Webinar on that issue. But
I think that the polarization that was referred to is not just affecting our communities. I think it's affecting our elected leaders as well. And I think that's why you're seeing so much hostility at times, even among governing bodies, because of the line that's been drawn. And I think that that is a key issue as to why so many of these issues of polarization continue to grow and fester, because of the inability of some of our elected officials to come to terms and recognize, as Rod has said, that one of their primary roles is to build trust in the community, and they can only do that by modeling the kind of respectful and civil behavior that we expect of all of our community members. But it's difficult when the elected leaders are not able to subscribe to that kind of behavior. And then it becomes incumbent upon city managers and staff to work with elected officials to remind them that, we are the people that the community is looking to for guidance and leadership. And if we can't demonstrate to them that we're at least respectful enough to hear a variety of opinions and perspectives on issues and be able to find common ground, then we're not going to be able to accomplish that in conversations with the community.
Well said. I thought that by having the council meetings and board meetings televised, that would somehow moderate behavior. That has not worked. I think, though, that what needs to be said and repeated is that it is okay to disagree. That's what deliberation is all about. We should have robust discussion. People should not be afraid to advocate for their position, but to always do that by being respectful of others and treating people with dignity and respect. And it also modeling that behavior, not just in terms of how elected officials relate to each other when they're on stage, but how they relate to the staff. Treating the staff with the same dignity and respect. And you are entitled as an elected official to get the information that you need in order to make an informed decision. It is not okay to berate the staff, to try to humiliate the staff, to attack the staff. And so it is that modeling that behavior. First of all, we're all in these positions we call leadership positions. Well, that requires a certain kind of conduct from each of us, and to keep trying to model that and reinforce it. I also think that public chastisement doesn't work. It is having these individual conversations, and that's a very difficult role actually for the city manager, to sit down and say, Mr. Mayor, with all due respect, and then lay it out. And so I always advise the city managers to try to get a council member to go along with you, so you're not there alone trying to do this. But modeling that behavior, the same thing we say about schools, and at some point we need to talk about the schools. We expect the teachers to model behavior, the principals. We expect the same thing of city managers and council members, and we hope that we can elevate that.
I think sometimes as elected officials, we, certainly want to bring people into our offices to sit down and listen to their concerns. But I think in a time of crisis, it's probably more important than ever to meet people where they're at. In other words, get out of your office, go into the neighborhoods, whether it's meeting with a small group of leaders in the community or a town hall meeting. Give them an opportunity to express what their concerns are, what their desires are. And, once you've kind of distilled that, I think you can begin to kind of lay out a plan of action of, okay, how are we going to try to address that? And it isn't always about money. Sometimes it's just about respect and trying to realize that, some areas of our communities don't have the services that they should have. And there are some inequities. And those are the times, or this is the time now, I think, to begin to address those.
Okay, thank you, Rod. I saw your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, the Institute for Local Government has been doing some research on what are the attributes of highest performing councils and boards. And they have some articles that are free on our website that set forth the 6 attributes of the highest performing councils and boards. And it is now accepted as a best practice that at least once a year, the governing body ought to have a special meeting where they aren't there dealing with issues, they're not legislating, but instead they're taking stock of how they are governing. Are they governing within their codes of conduct, their norms, their council guidelines, that type of thing. How are they working with one another, the community they serve, and the staff that supports them? And those that are take this seriously tend to have the highest level of respect and civility. Those that don't have those norms or guidelines or codes of conduct generally do not. And so I commend those articles to you, which are on our website and free to all.
Thank you, Rod. That's a great reminder. And I do have a note in the Q&A box that it is challenging as a city manager or a staff member to coach an elected official toward that respectful behavior. And I think some of the things that Rod's talking about, which include that annual planning framework and include some of those best practices, will help some of those local leaders at the staff level create the opportunity to speak about those issues in a less threatening way and in a less direct way, but really about how to move forward as a local agency with a strategic plan in mind and with shared values in mind. And it's not necessarily a calling out or an independent thing that you're doing for one specific problematic elected official or other. It's really about making sure that your organization as a local agency is moving forward in the right direction. And that can minimize some of that difficulty with having that challenging conversation. I do have one more question.
More to the point on that, if I might, Erica, is for city managers to remind councils, the entire council, that they're a team. And as a team member, the city manager can be part of the collective group in sharing, observations about what certain types of behavior are reflecting about the entire team, so that it doesn't call out an individual, but that it demonstrates that the city manager, as much as the elected officials, are invested as a team in the way that they are portraying, and developing trust with the community. And I think that's a beneficial strategy to try and use in talking about modeling the behavior we want to see in the community.
Thank you. And I do want to acknowledge certainly that ILG supports cities, counties, special districts. We have city and county representatives here today. Special districts have similar challenges, and I know there's been a couple of comments in the Q&A about the role of clerks and the role of county executives and other members of staff. I think that these strategies can be utilized across numerous local agencies, and particularly those that have an elected official relationship and staff relationships. And so certainly ILG has resources related to all of those, and we are happy to talk you through some of that as well. One follow-up question that we've gotten in the chat that I think is interesting, and it's a philosophical question. How can we listen when we cut off public speakers after 2 minutes during council meetings? So how do we model that listening and model that engagement when we are actively kind of prescribing to the 2 or 3 minute public comment period? Any thoughts on that, especially when people have so much to say, but you do want to make sure that you have civil meetings and civil engagement during your council meetings? Henry.
Well, there is no law that says that you're limited to 2 minutes. It's one that we have adopted over time. And of course, the reason for that, and actually there's a good reason for it. I am a witness of many, many council meetings where there are items that have been noticed for the agenda. It's a public hearing. There are 150 people there for the public hearing. We have open forum, and we can't act on whatever is raised during open forum. The best you can do is refer it to staff to come back with something. And so we have a parade of speakers who are there to talk about a matter that is very important to them and important to the community, but it's not a noticed item. The board can't act on it. And then we have people who've been sitting there for 2 hours to talk about an item that is on the agenda. I witnessed one where an elderly woman sat for 3 hours to talk about an item that was on the agenda, and 11:30 at night, we heard from her because we spent 2 hours hearing from the open forum speakers. I think that two things. One is to remind people who have critical items to work with the manager or council member or the mayor to have the item on the agenda so it can be properly noticed. The second is to remind people at the beginning of open forum that the board of council is limited. It cannot act on these items. And you want to be respectful of people who come to open forum. You want that to be a welcoming opportunity. But the council can also be flexible. If you have 2 or 3 people who are there to talk about an issue that's very urgent, you might give them more time. The other is practice that I fully recommend, whether it's noticed or not. When you have a parade of speakers, have people try to group themselves so that one person is allowed to speak, say, for 5 minutes, because others are waiving their time. Those are processes and mechanisms that you can use, but always being respectful of the public.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. Rod, did you have a comment on this before we move on?
I would like to suggest that the public hearing process is probably the worst way imaginable to try to get the authentic voice of the community.
Exactly.
And even though Henry's suggesting very commonsensical tweaks to it, I want to go back to Greg's comment, which is if it's an issue that you think really interests the community, or people are quite concerned and want to be heard, get out of City Hall, get out of the government center, go to where the people are already meeting and where they're comfortable, and set up a way for them to talk to one another and listen more. Ask open-ended questions, group people together. Don't give time limits. Let people hear from one another. Facilitate those discussions. Take down what you're hearing without judgment, without criticism, and then go back and filter it. Think through what you're hearing from residents. That's a much better way to get a real sense of where the community is coming from than the public hearing process.
Well, let me just clarify something. My comment was to the open forum speakers, not the public hearing process. Many of us are bound by charter to have, mandated to have public hearings. And those, to your point, Rod, those are not the ones that take up a whole lot of time. My point is the people who have come to hear what the result is from the public hearing are sitting there for 3 hours if you don't control the public forum process. My comments were only addressing open forum, not the public hearing process.
I agree fully.
I think that the point is that trying to have true conversations and engagement with the community is really difficult to achieve in a business meeting when you're focused on business, which I think is what Rod was alluding to, in that if you want to have those conversations, they're best held, you know, in a separate setting, in a special meeting kind of setting, and one that maybe is facilitated by an organization like ILG, so that the city manager and elected officials, or whatever governing body is having this kind of an event, has an opportunity to participate and not have to lead the conversation. So I think that those critical, you know, those crucial conversations around the issues that we're talking about affecting communities today really need to be separate from conducting city business.
Agreed. Absolutely.
Thank you for that. And I do want to appreciate that as we think about the context for this conversation, which includes the national impacts on local communities, you're absolutely going to see some of that angst, some of that stress, some of those frustrations spilling out in local conversations. And it is important to have those resources and the ability to give the community time to express those thoughts and then utilize their feedback to develop policies that will support those communities, as Greg was talking about. I want to move us on to, since we are talking about it already a little bit, we're alluding to it, the COVID pandemic. So I think at the local level, we have seen, unlike any other, I would say, Great Depression potentially has the potential to be worse, or at least as bad. But this pandemic has stretched local resources. It's challenged the fabric of our communities, and you've seen when you combine that with a polarizing election and other conversations, lots of tension. But the vaccine is rolling out. There's hope. There is movement towards a national strategy that's solidifying. What opportunities do you see that exist at the local level as it relates to COVID, and what you're moving forward with now? And I know some of you are actively involved in this COVID response. What are your thoughts?
Maybe I can start on that one. I think this pandemic has certainly demonstrated the health disparities that exist at least in San Diego County, and I assume probably in most communities across the state of California and the country. And those are pretty severe disparities. I happen to represent a supervisorial district that's about 80% minority up until January 4th. I represented it. And strong community ties, but large family units, a tremendous Hispanic population and Black population. And I think this pandemic certainly demonstrated, particularly in the Latino community, that they, because of their larger family units, the fact that they didn't have health plans, not surprisingly, they really took it on the chin as far as COVID-19. It's about 36% of our county population, but about 62% of those individuals that came down with COVID-19 were Latino. And so I think it certainly has demonstrated that we have a lot of work to do in San Diego County to try to make sure that we reach out, make sure that people have health plans. One of the benefits in the Latino community is there's always a strong family presence. A lot of the mothers in the Latino community are willing to roll up their sleeves. We call them promotoras that will go out and knock on doors. It sometimes takes somebody from that culture, or depending on where you are, that religion, that race, to get out and actually connect with people in their communities to let them know that there are resources available. And that's the sad thing. I mean, the resources are out there. It's just trying to figure out the best way to make those resources available where the greatest need is. Right now, our biggest challenge in San Diego County is trying to make sure that we provide the vaccines in an equitable manner. Now, when I say equitable, it's not equal. Again, we should be going where the biggest problems are, and that's in the minority communities, to make sure that they get the vaccinations that they need and the support that they need. And I think that's a challenge that we're still trying to work through. And I think the same thing is true for the state of California. I think there's some significant disparities in the way that vaccines have been made available and how they're being distributed.
Absolutely.
Erica,
I think that, go ahead.
I think that the COVID pandemic has really created an opportunity for local government, especially, although I think government at all levels, but especially at the local level, that it's created an opportunity for us to reimagine the way that we meet the needs of the community, especially around these issues of equity and social justice, but just in general, to step back and reimagine how we can deliver all services equitably, efficiently, effectively, and to set aside the assumptions that we can only operate in one way, and that is with everyone working at City Hall at a computer. And you know, we've shown over the last year that we've had tremendous resilience at the local level in being able to pivot and to make the changes necessary to ensure the safety and health of our workforce, of our community members, and yet still conduct the business of government. So that amazing resilience and the ability to pivot as quickly as we have and to show that it could work effectively, I think has been a tremendous opportunity for us to reimagine who we are and what we do. The challenge, I think, going forward is going to be taking that model and continuing to move forward and adapt and to continue to innovate, and not to fall back into the way that we used to operate, because that's an easier model. And once revenues start flowing in again, to think that we should just go back to the way things were. We should take the opportunity that we have seen and continue to build on it, I believe.
Thank you for that. That's really interesting too, because you talk about this, you know, that we all had to pivot. We all had to make adjustments just to survive the last year. Let's not go back to what was the original. Like we don't want this, the new normal maybe is an adjustment forever. And then think about innovation, think about resilience, think about creativity in our operations, and how to deliver services differently and better in this new model. Henry, and I see Rod as well. Hi, Henry.
Hi. I want to correct the record. When you introduced us, it showed that we're all retired. I was at our family home in Florida, minding my own business, and I got a call that they needed some help at the Oakland Coliseum. The executive director had to be removed. And so I said, well, this is a short-term thing, and it's, you know, I'll do it for 2 or 3 months while I go through a recruitment. That was in August of 2019. I'm still there, and they've made me permanent. I tell you that because I got ahead of myself and suggested a couple of months ago that the parking lot at the Coliseum could be more efficiently used if we worked with the health providers for COVID vaccinations. And then the governor and the president came in and decided to designate the Oakland Coliseum site as one, actually it was the first that was designated for mass vaccinations. So I know everything that I should know about how the process works and how it doesn't work, and how myturn.ca.gov has been a real challenge for many people in the community. What it calls for, though, is we cannot get back to doing much of anything until we have been successful with these vaccinations. And there are challenges aplenty. One is supply, which continues to constrain how fast we're able to move. The other is back to the equity issue. It's what Greg said. And it's not a surprise. We anticipated this, we knew it, we should have done a better job of addressing it, that those who have historically been left behind will be left behind again unless we act proactively to make sure they're not left behind. And so a lot of my work has nothing to do with operating the Coliseum, has been working with this mass vaccination task force that I organized to make sure that we meet people where they are with the need. And so we have not relied just on myturn.ca.gov. We have pushed for and have been successful in getting mobile units out to the community, getting the faith-based communities to set up sites for vaccination, to tell people in the underserved communities the importance of being vaccinated, and in making sure that we don't put them through our typical bureaucratic red tape, which almost ensures that they will be the last to be vaccinated if they get around to being vaccinated at all. It is in our health interest, it's in our business interest, it's in our interest to get government back up and running and doing what it should be doing. And I want to second what Pat said. This is an opportunity for us to do some serious learning, to force us to be creative in terms of how we deal with this issue, and that we continue to use that learning as we go forward, not just for COVID-19, but for all the work that we do at local government. I'm biased, and I'm not ashamed to say it. I will always be biased. The most important work is done at the local level. It's done at the local level. And to the extent that we can be efficient, that we can be the model for others, that should be our goal.
Wonderful, thank you. And I just need to acknowledge that every single one of our panelists, Henry included, is horrible at being retired. In fact, I don't think any of you actually are, except for maybe Greg, who just recently termed out of office, but I know he's got some things up his sleeve as well. You're all overachievers, and I would never want to acknowledge that you aren't doing at least 5 things at once every day. So I did want to go to Rod and give him a chance to answer this question before we move on.
Yeah. A few thoughts on what local governments should do in this next phase of the COVID pandemic. First is to continue to broadcast in any way possible reliable, science-based information about the health issues involved and the precautions people should take. Second, as Anthony Fauci continues to warn, this is no time to take the foot off the gas. And at public meetings and public gatherings, local governments should be insisting that people take basic precautions so we don't have another surge of infections, illnesses, and deaths. The good news is that based on the stimulus bill that is about to be signed by President Biden, local governments in California and across the nation are about to receive millions and millions of dollars that are desperately needed to shore up their local budgets and to help their local businesses get back into business. Making the most of those dollars, which are not going to come again, is critically important. Not wasting them, being intentional, is really important at this phase of the crisis. And I would also suggest doubling down on emergency preparedness, because too many local governments hope they'll never use those services, put those aside, don't fund them, don't exercise them. We know that just because the pandemic is beatable in the next year doesn't mean that there won't be other crises, human or natural, in California. So getting back to getting used to operating in the EOC, making sure your people are well trained, well equipped is incredibly important, just because there will be more problems in our fair state in the near future. And then, as Pat was indicating and Henry was seconding, let's continue the things that are working. Let's continue to use flex schedules for our employees. Let's do more e-government. Let's find continued ways to help small businesses in town to continue to survive in the midst of this huge challenge. And then lastly, find ways to give a break to our staffs. They've been working flat out now for over a year. Many of them are burned out. How to help them get a second wind at this point is incredibly important. So elected and appointed leaders need to figure out a way to allow their staffs to regroup, to re-energize for the new phase. Those are my thoughts.
Thank you for that. And you're absolutely right. And I do hear, you touched on something I was going to touch on a little bit later, but I think now's a great time to talk about what could happen this week. I don't think I've seen a news article that says it's happened, but there's definitely legislation moving at the federal level to provide some relief for cities and counties and local governments. And that is definitely something that's going to be needed to help move this forward. But there will be some complexity around how to utilize those funds, how to maximize those funds. And I know that there are, in one of your roles, I think on the board of HDL and others, there are agencies that might be able to help with some of that financial planning and specifically accounting around those issues. And I know we're all eagerly looking to find out if that is signed and how those funds will be allocated and when, because those will be critical. And then equitable distribution and dissemination of that funding across the state for cities, counties, special districts of all sizes is critical as we move forward with what could be a very long fiscal crisis for the next few years.
It's done, except the ink may not be dry, but the stimulus bill has passed. It is only waiting for the president's signature.
Presidential signature.
A done deal. And one quick comment. I trust local government to be much wiser and much more efficient in how to use the money than I trust the federal government.
Thank you, Henry.
I think you're seeing some nodding heads there. We are getting lots of questions in the chat, and I did want to flag something, Rod, you said, and I'm going to answer or ask a question from Devin, actually, related to technology. You mentioned something about being innovative and leveraging all the resources that are available to help local agencies innovate. Have you thought about or have you seen how we might use technology right now to improve local government services, operations, and programming? Have you seen anything that's worked in your jurisdictions or in those that you've been working around?
Well, I think technology has enabled cities to provide a variety of remote services that we never thought we could provide. Online permitting and inspection services, things that we felt we always had to have a person available to meet at a counter in an office or to go out in the field. We have found that technology can be used very effectively. I think the ability of cities to very quickly pivot at the beginning of the pandemic in providing access to the public via Zoom meetings and that kind of thing to attend council meetings so that they could participate in local government activities remotely. And you're seeing it in so many different ways that we're using the ability to communicate directly with the public. And in some instances, recognizing that there is a disparity of access to technology. But for those who have it, I think we're enabling people to have greater access to a lot of activities of government because of the way that we have been employing technology. And I think that the concern that we're replacing people with technology, it still requires people to use the technology. So I think that it's incumbent upon those who are working in government on a day-to-day basis to really use the technology and adapt it in the best way possible to serve the community.
Thanks for that. And I will just echo that, there are a lot of organizations that are doing fantastic work for and around local agencies. Some of ILG's partners actually do a fantastic amount of work to sort of to streamline and adjust the operations. And something that you might want to look for if you do sign up for our newsletter or for our social media feeds is that we do like to tout those best practices and some of those case stories for things that are going well, things that have really adjusted the way that we do business. And I think we're all moving at lightning speed in our response to the pandemic and other things. And we are happy over the course of this year to be sharing out some of these new technologies and resources for planners, for people that are financial analysts, for those that are really looking for ways to do things differently and better and really make government as efficient as possible. All right, I want to keep us moving because we're going quickly on time and the questions are rolling through. I did want to switch gears just a little bit. We touched on it, but I'd love to just dive in a little bit about the twin pandemics. And when I say that, I say that the year of 2020, I think we all heard, has been described as that, the year of the twin pandemics, which means COVID-19 and social justice. And some of you started to talk about equity and inequity and social justice discussions. But as we think about what happens at the national level and about leadership on social justice and equity initiatives, what do you all think about how local agency leaders should be thinking about social justice right now in light of the polarizing conversations and challenges with discussions? What questions should they be asking when you're considering if and how to make a systemic change in your cities, in your counties, in your special districts, when there's a risk, right, personally and otherwise? What are your thoughts around that?
Well, go ahead, Rod.
I think it is incumbent upon local governments to take very seriously the need to audit their services and projects for equity and fairness. Whether it's capital improvement programs, the way law enforcement is operated in their jurisdictions, community services, the community engagement, hiring and procurement, go through and look to make sure that the benefits and the penalties are fairly distributed in the population. And that should just be an ongoing process to go test that and then make corresponding corrections as we go. And in our civic engagement, we ought to be asking who's not at the table, who's not showing up, and then go figure out by talking to those folks, what will it take to get them to the table so that their voices can be heard? And lastly, I would suggest that local leaders refrain from the tired notion that although equity and justice issues are important, that it's not timely to address them. That's the worst possible response that local government could provide at this time.
Thank you.
In San
Pat,
Diego,
I see your...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Greg, and then I'll go to Pat.
Okay, I know in San Diego County, we've been trying to address a lot of inequities that have existed for a long time. The fact is that a child in Barrio Logan is going to probably have 8 times the likelihood of having asthma than a child in, say, La Jolla. Why is that? Because of land use decisions that have been made, the fact that communities don't have the types of amenities that they should have. And so, I mean, you don't have to go out and hire a consultant. I think the data is readily available if you choose to look at it, that will begin to address some of these inequities that exist in our communities. And there's communities that are underserved. There's populations with low vaccination rates just for regular immunizations for school, high birth mortality rates, high asthma rates. I mean, these are all things that are readily available if you choose to look for that information. And then I think you have to do some real soul searching, and it's not going to be corrected overnight, but begin to realize that maybe some of the land use decisions that you're making are certainly either perpetuating or creating these inequities that have some long-term health consequences and impacts.
Excellent. Thank you. Pat?
So, I think all of those issues that both Rob and Greg have raised are important, but I think one of the overarching things that needs to be asked is or looked at is what are the community's values? Because I think that I think a conversation around values and what we as a community, as elected officials, as a city organization, and how are we going to align our community values with what we're doing to meet the needs of our community. But without examining the values, then you can't really know the best way to align the needs of the community and whose needs are being met in a more equitable way than another group's needs. And so I think that kind of has to be the starting point, because I think when you, as important as the issues of equity and social justice are, to just take those issues and try to create, some policy direction around that without really understanding the values in the community and how whatever changes need to be made to align with those values, I think that you're not necessarily going to accomplish what you set out to do. So I think that is, focusing on the values is one of the first conversations I think that needs to occur.
Well, and it all goes full circle, right? We're talking about authentic engagement, and connecting with your community on a personal level, finding out where you have shared values, and that's more qualitative. But then there's also the quantitative side, right? There's research that can be done around what people care about, what is of importance, is there alignment, where is there disparity, and how can you develop policy at the local level to support that, and then advance changes that can make your communities better and stronger. I did want to put in a flag that some comments came in the Q&A and in the chat that the stimulus bill is being signed right now, so it's very likely that by the end of this conversation there will be some sort of plan moving forward for funding for local agencies from the federal government. So thank you for those comments. Did anyone else want to talk a little bit about that?
Oh, wait a minute.
You?
Oh, no. I'm going to talk about the elephant in the room.
Okay.
No, we're going past this. What happened in 2020 was not really related to my streets have not been paved in 30 years. That's not what caused all of this disturbance. It wasn't related to the fact that my garbage is picked up sometimes it's not picked up. What caused the firestorm was Black men being arrested, sometimes for no probable cause, and ended up dead. For someone being involved in some incident, walking away from the police, and shot in the back. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about social justice. And I don't think we can escape that. I agree with Pat entirely. You start talking about those values and but you have to get to this issue. We are not safe as a society. If my son cannot drive from Oakland to Palo Alto to his job without my worrying about whether or not somebody's going to stop him and he ends up being shot, that's what I'm talking about. And I think that as a local community, we have to face that issue. How do we start this conversation and continue this conversation so that we reach a point in our society when I am no more concerned about my son coming back home alive as Rod is concerned about his coming back home alive? That's what I'm talking about. And that is the elephant in the room. We have to have honest, forthright conversation about that. Not all communities are alike. They're different. I understand that. I will never forget I've had a couple of incidents myself. One, I was visiting a friend who lives in Moraga. I don't think they'd seen a Black person in 20 years. And I was coming back from their house down the hill, and I entered a curve that there was no sign suggesting that, and I saw his lights come on. The officer stopped me, and he asked me politely some questions, and I responded, and I'll never forget how I responded to him. After we had had a few exchanges, he said, "What country are you from?" And I said, "I beg your pardon?" He said, what country are you from? I said, I'm from the country of Florida. He said, oh, he said, you sound like you have an accent. I said, I do. It's called English. He became very embarrassed, and a young guy, white. And I said, no, it's okay. It's okay. So my point is, I want to be stopped the same as Rod is stopped. And I want to go home the same as Rod would go home. That's what I'm talking about.
Indeed.
Well, this is why this panel was assembled, so you can speak your truth, and I love that. How do they do this at the local level? You've talked about research, you talked about understanding your community. There's a comment or a question in the chat about, is it community global, or is it residents and people that live within your jurisdiction? Because certainly those boundaries matter. How do local leaders lead in this area when it is so difficult to move that forward? And it's especially given what we started talking about at the beginning about polarization and maybe not seeing eye to eye on these social justice issues within your council, within your staff. How do you begin to have that conversation internally with the operations within your city or your county or your special district? And then how do you then take it out into your community and specifically within the boundaries of your jurisdiction? It is not an easy question. Anyone want to talk about that one?
It is not an easy question, and it's not an easy answer. But let me also make the point that defunding the police is about the most, I can't describe it. Who is really in favor of defunding the police? We don't mean that. I don't know people who say that really mean that. If somebody breaks in your house and they've got an M16, who are you going to call? You're going to call Social Services Department. I think that the point is about reimagining police services and how we respond to crises and how we deal with mental health issues and how do we train our officers so that when they arrive at a scene, the first thing they don't think of is that this Black person has done something wrong and we ought to shoot them. It is part of training, it's part of dealing with a lot of work has been done in Oakland by a professor at Stanford. I can't think of her name right now. And it's around how we view bias, how we internalize that, how we retrain ourselves, how we think about what constitutes a safe community. And we're only safe if everybody's safe. And have that conversation. And I think you start that where we started. That's in the small group discussions. Back to what Pat said too, though, talking about, what are our values? What are our core values? What do we expect as a community? How do we live safely? How do we treat everybody with that respect for life and safety and security and all of those things? And let's recognize something else. We didn't just get here. We all bring our history, our growing up, our blindness. People I've talked to, I don't know how many people have said to me, I never thought about this issue. I grew up in an environment where there was nobody of color. I went to college and met the first Hispanic I'd ever met in my life. And so I had some learning and catching up to do. And let me tell you something else. Racism works both ways. Black people have been so injured by some of this stuff that they don't think that much of white people either. We need to have an honest discussion about that as well. We all bring all of that hurt and pain and prejudice and blindness and lack of awareness with us. And we need to have honest and open conversation about that without accusation, without offending people, without being accusatory, without causing everybody a racist because they say something that is offensive to us that they have no awareness of. We need to educate ourselves about all of those things and be respectful of each other always.
In that process, right? Even though you're having very difficult conversations about
Yes.
very complicated, with a lot of trauma. I saw, Greg, I think I saw your hand maybe even before Pat's, and I just want to make sure I'm being mindful of the order. You started to talk first.
Well, maybe just a couple of observations. Obviously, as a local elected official, you are the face of your community, and how you react to a crisis is going to be, I think, indicative of people's perception of what the problem is. I can tell you that San Diego County was actually, I think, the first county in the United States declared a public health emergency with COVID on February 14th. And frankly, it was because we had a very bad experience 2 years before where we had a Hep A crisis which ended up taking 20 lives. And we were, to be honest, we were slow to respond. And I don't think we wanted to be in that situation again. I think we've learned a lot of lessons. And I guess I come back to the point that it's terrible to miss an opportunity because of a crisis that's been presented to you. A lot of opportunities to improve what you're doing, the response, the community outreach. Now is the time to really take a look at what all those shortcomings are that you've identified as a result of this crisis. And I think one thing that we learned not only locally but statewide and nationwide is we were woefully unprepared to deal with the crisis that is at hand. And that's probably true for most communities, whether they're responding to fires or floods or hurricanes or tornadoes, tsunamis. I mean, you name the crisis. I think we have to do a better job in local government to try to, as best we can, be prepared to respond. And one of the things we learned after our 2003 fires is that we didn't have a way to let people know that their homes were in jeopardy. We had deputies pounding on doors at 1 a.m. in the morning to let people know that their house was on fire. So you talked earlier about technology. We implemented a reverse 911 phone system that actually morphed into a mass notification system. So when we had the 2007 fires, we evacuated over 500,000 people from their homes in a very orderly manner because they were able to geocode the areas for different phone messages to let them know that they needed to leave their home. So technology can certainly work in our advantage, but I think, the old Boy Scout model is probably not a good example to use now, but you always need to be prepared.
Absolutely. Pat, you had to comment. Thank you for being patient.
Oh, no worries. I think that what is required is a great deal of courage. And I think that it's courage among elected officials, it's courage among our colleagues in the profession, city managers and county managers, those who have leadership roles in our public organizations. Because it's very easy, I think, in the polarizing environment that we're facing today, to want to ignore, as Henry mentioned, the elephant in the room. It's easier to focus on the things that we can try and fix. And in doing so, we are losing out on a huge opportunity to begin to heal the wounds that have existed for a very, very long time and never been acknowledged. And now that they've been raised to the forefront, there's that opportunity for us to deal with those issues head on. And I think that at least in our profession as city managers, I think that part of our responsibility as leaders of our organizations, as embodied in our code of ethics, is that we have a responsibility to deal with issues of social equity. It's one of the pillars of public administration that we deal with issues that provide for meeting the needs of all people in our communities in an equal manner. And I think that unless we are courageous and willing to stand up and acknowledge where we are falling short in those areas, then that elephant in the room is going to continue to exist. And it's not going to get more positive. It's going to continue to erode the fabric of not just our local communities, but of our society. And we're already seeing that breakdown on a national level. And I'm hearing it from communities across the country that are confronted with these issues and very afraid to take them on. Very afraid. I've heard from colleagues in many other parts of the country that it's not their responsibility to deal with social justice. And it is, but it takes great courage.
Agreed. There are a lot of comments in the chat and in the Q&A about, how to, honor this conversation, and then you begin to embed these conversations into both operations and then again, externally as well within your communities. And many are acknowledging that it's not easy. It's very difficult. Again, it's about leading with courage and leading with heart. And then I will also put in a plug for some of our affiliates and eventually ILG as well. I do know that the League of California Cities just launched an Advancing Equity Task Force to consider what opportunities and resources and training is needed to begin to have these conversations at the city level, and to think about internal operations, but then also external conversations and communication with residents. And I know that the counties, through CSAC, through its institute, and CSDA are doing similar things. ILG will also be adding equity lenses to all of its pillars and thinking about how to engage in this conversation in a way that meets communities where they are, because every community is going to be in a different place, and every resident and every local elected official and every local leader needs to understand how to personalize that for themselves. And so we do hope to begin to have those conversations with you and help you move through that very challenging topic. As we move forward, I want to make sure we're getting to all of the questions. And so there are so many questions about poverty and financial literacy and thinking about resilience in the economy and emergency management, where we've gone all over the place. And I want to give people a chance to throw in more questions. But so I'll ask one more question before we go to the kind of mishmash of questions we've gotten in the chat. We talked a little bit about, from all of you, what the pandemic has taught us, what opportunities exist, how we might consider the role of local government given everything that's happening at the national level. You've given us really fantastic insights. I would love to know what advice you might give to local agency leaders, elected officials, or staff who are just trying to find their footing right now to figure out what they should be doing, how they should be moving. If there is one or two things you think that they just really need to know, or a leadership trait you think they should really be exhibiting, what would that be before we go to the broad Q&A?
You know, maybe I can start off. I think as a local elected official, I think the one thing that hopefully I've learned over the years is that you need to listen more. There's an old adage that says that you never learn anything while you're talking, and I think that's very true. You need to listen to your constituents, what their concerns are, try to figure out what is real, what is maybe just emotion. But I think if we do a better job of listening to what the concerns are, then we can begin to address some of the underlying issues that are out there. Again, we're not going to solve these things overnight, but bottom line is, I think if we can listen, I think we're going to become more empathetic in regards to what needs to be done and what the concerns are. And again, I come back to the point, I think that we need to do a better job of being prepared in the future for whatever the next crisis is going to be. And let me tell you, we will have more crises, no matter what their shape or form comes in. So those would be my words of advice.
Excellent. Rod?
Agreeing fully with Supervisor Cox that listening and empathy are key. I'd also just recommend to elected leaders and appointed leaders that what we've learned in this crisis, we've seen many times before, and that is that whether the crisis is statewide, national, or even global, as in the case of this pandemic, people look to their local governments for information and support. And you can't simply wait for the federal government or the state to come to your rescue. You need to be able to operate immediately at the local level. So building the relationships with the other local agencies, with your NGOs and nonprofits, so that you are in a position to mobilize rapidly and meet the needs. Whether or not the state or the federal government has to act together is absolutely critical.
Excellent. Thank you. Henry?
I would say always remember why we serve. Always remember why we serve. The second thing I would say is that we are very skilled. We have been tried and tried and tried, and we've come through always, balancing a lot of stuff. We have dealt with fires that have devastated the state. We've dealt with earthquakes. We're going to be dealing with more fires. At some point, the question is not whether, but when we're going to have to deal with an earthquake, and we have to keep the place going. Remember why we serve. The other is always be responsive to the constituents. Yeah, that's our highest priority is to be responsive to the constituents. And I would add a third: do not be afraid to ask for help. You have resources through the league, you have resources through ILG, you have resources through these retired city managers who are truly retired and aren't doing anything. Greg Cox, give him a call. But use the resources that are available to you and do not be afraid to ask for help.
Good.
Excellent. Pat, did you want to say anything before we go into our broad Q&A?
I think I would just add one final thing, and actually it kind of goes back to something we talked about earlier on, and that is that remember that our role is to build trust among members of our communities, and that in everything that we do, that transparency is required, and that we communicate. Communication is what helps to build trust, and keeping people informed about what's going on, the issues that are being confronted in a community, how are they being dealt with, the opportunities for people to share their thoughts about what's going on in the community, and to really create an effective means for communication, especially when the normal channels and the normal venues for the public to engage their elected leaders don't exist today in the same model, but there are methods for effective communication, and we need to employ them much more broadly, so that the community realizes that they are being listened to, they will be heard, and that we are building that relationship of trust with them.
Thank you for that. Well, I do want to thank all of you for your insights and for your guidance. And we do have a couple other straggling questions in the chat. And one of them is related to our earliest part of the dialogue around conversations of civility and with civility and respect, and really connecting with your fellow elected leaders around, how do you make sure that you're all on the same page? And one person acknowledged that they're having a challenge talking to fellow council members because of the Brown Act, and any suggestions for connecting public, their fellow council members in public dialogue, like you recommended, going into those town halls and having those very, honest conversations with residents, given that there is some challenge and some transparency laws required under the Brown Act. Any success that you've had doing that? Henry.
Retreats do work, and even by Zoom. Actually, they might be even more effective right now by Zoom, because people can hide their faces and do whatever while they're talking. But I highly recommend the retreats. They have to be open to the public. And where there is personal conflict, that's not the best place to try to address it. But I think raising the issue of, and I've done a lot of those, by starting with what is it that we do well as a group? Always start out with the positive and build on that. Where are the areas where we need to improve in terms of our communications, in terms of, without ever becoming personal? And you do need a neutral party who is authorized to step in and say, oh, no, none of that. No personal attacks. No, we're not going there, because these are open meetings. But they start the dialogue in a meaningful way, and then those can be followed up with the one-on-one. Because you're absolutely right. You can't have these seriatim meetings. That's a violation. But I've done many of those where the public is invited. The press comes. The press is going to be there. And so, you need to keep the boundaries. But it's a good place, I think, to start the conversation and then lead from that to the more individual conversations. And I ask people to, without recognizing who said it, write down on a piece of paper so nobody knows who said it. What is really getting in the way of our being successful, and no names. And that helps too.
Excellent, thank you. We have time for one more question, and this is an interesting one, and I thought I would just siphon all of your expertise on this one, because you may have experienced this in your careers. We've got someone on the line who's having some challenges as an elected official, having challenges with staff. And feeling as though the polarization and the difficulty is actually coming from the staff level up and not from the elected official level down. Thoughts about that, and maybe some solutions for this person in just a couple seconds. Rod.
Oftentimes, the cause of the friction between elected leaders and the professional staff is lack of clarification on roles. Just because you know a lot about a subject doesn't mean that you're the right person to implement the council's policy or the board's policy on that subject. Keeping the elected leaders providing the overall direction, deciding the ultimate outcome that is sought, and then allowing staff to figure out the means to that end and implement that policy with a feedback loop is absolutely critical. And too often the elected leaders forget that local government is the ultimate team sport. Just because you ran as an individual and then talked to your neighbors about what you would do or not do if you were elected to the board or to the city council doesn't mean that once you are elected that your agenda is now the board's or the council's. No, not at all. You must work in concert with your colleagues on the council or board and with your professional staff in order to get anything done of significance. And sometimes that's not understood by elected leaders or effectively appreciated. And having regular conversations with a county manager or city manager as a council member to better understand how to accomplish broad goals is critical to the overall success.
Excellent. Yeah. Thank you so much. Go ahead.
I think it's incumbent that you realize what your role is as an elected official. Your role is to set policy. It's not to tell the staff how to implement that policy. And sometimes that's hard for elected officials to understand. But I tell you that staff in my years in local government have been very helpful sometimes in making sure that we haven't gone down a path that maybe we went down before, that we were not prepared for the consequences or haven't really fully looked at all of the ramifications of what we think we want to do as elected officials. So I think, a staff is your friend. They're not your enemy. And, once you set the policy, it's really up to them to figure out the best way to get it done.
Thank you. All right, Henry, close us out.
I want to make a quick comment about this. And it may not be one that all of the city managers are willing to hear. I would strongly advise city managers to remember this. You are appointed, not anointed. And the elected people are elected, and that's for a good reason. I think it's important to have that healthy dialogue and also distinguish between, is this just an issue between this elected official and manager, or is this becoming a problem in terms of how the council is viewing how the manager is, quotes, withholding information, hiding the information, not being forthcoming about the issue? Then that requires some real conversation. That's a closed session item with the city manager. The last thing I would say is that, as a city manager, you give the council your best professional advice. At the end of the day, they do with it what they will. You have an abiding obligation to say, I recommend against this, and here's why. But if they're hell bent on doing it, you just bow your head and hope for the best. And I will leave you with this one. A council member being very upset with me at one meeting said, well, city manager, that's fine for you to sit there and say. He said, but we have to stand for election every 4 years. I had no contract. I never wanted one. So I said, oh, yes, that's true. But I have to stand for reappointment every Tuesday night.
You share.
Well, on that note, I think that is a perfect closing for our first leading local topic. I did want to get us back to our PowerPoint and wrap up this session. And I can tell you, I could speak to you all afternoon, but I do know some people will want to grab lunch. I did want to ask Randy Kahan behind the scenes to pull up our slides again, because we wanted to ask all of those that are still on the line, if you would like, we would love your support moving forward with our next leading local topic. We have a number of ideas that we'd love to talk about, and we'd love to ask if there is a topic that you'd like to see next. We talked, can you go back one? We talked about a couple of things in today's session just to frame this series, and now we want to ask you on the line if there's a topic that you think would be great for our next session. So we're going to launch a quick poll that outlines a few of the topics we're considering, and we'd love to know which one you would like. So please stay on the line, and you can click one of the topics: building personal resilience, avoiding personal burnout or professional burnout, leading through conflict, de-escalating situations, building bridges and bridging divides, so unifying your community, implicit bias, understanding racism and bias, or equity, exploring equity in your agency and your community. The good news is we're going to try and bring all of these sessions to you over the course of this year, and additional ones as well, but we'd love to know if you have a preference for what we do next. And please let us know, Randy Kate, when we're ready to pull the poll. And again, we appreciate your feedback on this as we wrap up this session and begin planning for our next leading local topic. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we hope that you will stay connected with ILG. The best way to know what sessions are coming next is to connect with our communications channels. We are continuing to develop trainings and programs and resources around a wide range of issues tied to leading local, but others as well. All of our 4 pillars and really connecting to cities, counties, and special districts. This slide shows all of our social media handles and how to sign up for our newsletter, our alerts, and other efforts. And again, our focus is on quality over quantity, so we promise not to overload your inbox with chatter. Next slide. The recording for this session, if you'd like to listen to it or have it recommended to a friend, will be available soon, and we will gladly make that link available to everyone who registered for our session today. Next slide. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who, certainly our panelists who gave so many amazing insights today, and thank you to all of you who joined on the line today during part of your lunch hour. It is just great to hear from you all, hear from your insights from the panelists, and then also get the questions and concerns that you have as those that are listening in. And I just want to tell you that on behalf of the entire team at ILG, it has been an honor to have you join us, and I have been so grateful to spend some time with you today. So have a fantastic rest of your day, and please stay tuned for our next Leading Local session in a couple of weeks. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all.
Erica.
And I will ask Randy K to log us off.
Thanks, everyone.
Okay.
Yeah, that was fun.
See you all. Take care.
Good job, everybody.
Have a good